Lisa Lazarus, CEO of Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority, better known as HISA. Thank you so much for joining us here. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Lisa, for many that know what HISA does, they know that there's federal oversight over horse racing now, but not much else. Right. So what exactly is the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority tasked at doing?
So really we have two responsibilities, two very important responsibilities in racing. One is to oversee the safety of the horses and the riders, and essentially the safety of the whole enterprise of racing itself. And the second is to oversee an anti-doping and medication control program. And those are really our only two areas of authority and jurisdiction, and that's really what we've been working on.
What's the biggest challenge in unifying racing in 38 different jurisdictions?
So the biggest challenge, as you sort of highlighted in your emphasis in your question, is the fact that the states have operated on their own as sort of different fiefdoms, different entities, different regulators, running racing for so long. So to get all of them on the same page is a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge. It's sort of a labor of love, because I think all of us really believe that uniformity is necessary. Uniformity is going to be better for the sport, is going to really take the sport forward. But there's work to be done to make that happen, and that's probably the biggest challenge.
What's the biggest pushback that you felt in attempting to unify these jurisdictions?
So I think the pushback is mostly about fear of change. Horse racing is, probably the oldest sport in America. It's been practiced the same way for a really long time. And change is scary. It's an industry. A lot of people make their living from it, and they don't know what the future might look like in a different regulatory environment. And there's certainly misinformation out there and misgivings, but what I found is that once HISA actually launched and a lot of that misinformation sort of got dispelled and didn't bear fruit, didn't actually happen, that people started to understand that this really is something that's necessary and is going to be good for the sport.
You mentioned misinformation. What in particular do you think was out there that people weren't correctly understanding, or the misinformation that was out there?
There was a lot of rumors about, the scope of HISA's authority, what they could and couldn't regulate, concerns of people coming to folks' homes and searching and that kind of thing, which was not, part of the rules and not part of our intention. I had an exercise rider call me once, crying, saying, I weigh 130 pounds and I hear that I now won't be able to ride anymore, because he thought there was some sort of weight, limit, which wasn't true. So just really answering a lot of those questions that we're actually trying to do. And I think once, we actually launched on July 1, people could actually see that ultimately, we have more eyes on horses. We have, a lot more veterinary interaction with the horses across the country to make sure that, they're safe. And when the horses are safe, the riders are also much more likely to be safe.
Launched July 1st. You've been in this role since January. What do you feel truly has worked with HISA thus far?
I think the fact that I genuinely believe every day, making a difference when it comes to equine safety. And as we all know, equine safety sort of goes hand in hand with rider and jockey safety. The biggest risk for a jockey is obviously being on a horse that's not sound. So we bring awareness, we bring engagement, especially for, some of the states and tracks that are not, quite at the same level as some of the bigger tracks. We've really been able to work with them and I think get to a place where there is just better interaction, better oversight, and safer horses.
HISA has been rolled out in phases, it feels, or implemented at least in phases. Was that at all by design?
So originally it was supposed to launch both the anti-doping program and racetrack safety on July 1. But the Act requires that before the anti-doping medication control program launches, that we have an independent enforcement agency in place. Originally, the HISA board, before I actually was hired, was engaging with the U.S. anti-doping agency, USADA, to be the independent enforcement agency. When those talks did not result in an agreement between HISA and USADA, we then had to go out into the market and look at other possibilities. And so, given the timeline, we were not able to launch on July 1 because we didn't have an anti-doping agency in place. The Drug Free Sport International was only appointed in May of 2022.
Looking back, would you have done anything differently?
Absolutely not. Looking back, I actually think we're incredibly lucky that we're able to do it this way, because rolling out the racetrack safety program first has allowed us to engage with the states and understand the different nuances, how they operate, the different actors on a smaller scale. Because when we take over anti-doping, we take it over the entire space.
Right.
With racetrack safety, we have certain rules that are HISA and certain rules that are still state-run. But with anti-doping, it'll be entirely HISA.
So when the anti-doping program does roll out January 1st. What are your hopes for HISA?
So my hopes are that we are going to be able to deliver a level playing field, a sport that the entire public views as having integrity, having a level playing field, and we're going to be able to deliver that because we're going to have uniform rules, harmonized testing, harmonized labs.
Coming January 1st, the anti-doping and medication control program rolls out. What are the hopes there and the biggest things that you feel might still need to be worked out?
Our hopes are that, and actually not just our hopes, but our commitment is that we will have a level playing field for all trainers and all horsemen. So that ultimately any horse that gets tested, whatever state they're in, they're going to be subject to the same standards, the same substances will be prohibited across the country. Labs will analyze the samples in the same way. We'll have uniform enforcement, uniform prosecutions, and that will not just deliver that level playing field that horsemen deserve, but also be able to basically tell the story to the public that we have a sport that has integrity and is being monitored by a national, uniform, independent anti-doping agency.
There has been a lack of confidence in that area. How do you instill the confidence not only in those inside of the industry, but outside of it, that it truly is a level playing field?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what HISA brings. I believe that when you have uniform rules and a uniform list of substances that are prohibited, and especially, the laboratory testing that's consistent across the board, and really a professionalized system. We're also going to have a paperless chain of custody system that I don't think really any states currently have. And so the entire program is going to be run nationally, professionally, with consistent rules, and I think everyone's going to really be able to see and feel that, and that's going to give us the benefit of telling the public that, we really got this. We are like other sports. We have a national uniform program.
January 1st of 2023, the anti-doping and medication program is set to roll out, but there is some pushback from the industry that perhaps it's too soon, perhaps it should be delayed, so all ducks are in order. What would you say to that?
I would say we're ready. We're going to be able to roll out a robust uniform program come January 1, and I think it's what the industry wants and needs. So I would say, give it a chance, and really that I'm filled with confidence of what we're going to be able to achieve on January 1.
What about those racetracks that aren't accustomed to these rules and regulations, and the adjustments there might be slightly overwhelming for those that haven't experienced it before? Will they be ready January 1st?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, we're already out there with education. The Horse Racing Integrity and Welfare Unit, which is our enforcement agency, they have a website with educational materials, and I do think most horsemen are operating under some anti-doping programs. So it's just a question of becoming familiar with what substances our program prohibits, and how the program will be slightly different from what they're currently experiencing. That's going to obviously vary from state to state, but I do think we're going to be able to reach those education initiatives and be able to kind of get the word out ahead of January 1.
How important is communication as you enroll these
races?
It is.
Communication is the most important thing. It really is. I mean, speaking with people, making sure they understand, getting it out through the right channels. We're working a lot through the veterinarians now because we expect them to be the resource that a lot of horsemen go to around medication use, for example. And that's, we see that as sort of the first level, and that's a really important engagement for our team. But yes, communication is key because understanding and education is going to be the most important element, I think, to a successful rollout.
How challenging has that been?
It's challenging, but at the same time, the industry is filled with interest groups and stakeholder groups that meet, that have board meetings, that have Zoom. One of the great things of the sort of post-COVID era is that you can do anything by Zoom.
Right.
And you can fill a lot more Zooms in a day than you can maybe personal visits. So we're really gonna do as many of those as possible and engage with all of the stakeholder groups that are willing to let us come in and present.
Funding is, of course, for everything that you're talking about, a big question and a concern, especially for smaller racetracks that are struggling to stay afloat. What would you say to them to alleviate those concerns?
So the first thing I would say is that we understand at HISA, acutely that this is sort of industry funded and industry supported, and we spend the money that we think we need to deliver the programs that are going to help the sport and bring money into the sport. I don't think it's an accident that it's been an incredibly successful year for horse racing in terms of sales, in terms of handle. But also, the other thing that's important to know is that the HISA board has looked at this question very carefully, and the funding model itself takes into account racetracks that don't have strong purses and essentially gives them essentially treats them differently because we weight strength of purse and number of starts equally, which allows the smaller tracks to have less of a financial burden than the bigger tracks.
You mentioned a board, but there was a Horsemen's Advisory Group that was recently created consisting of trainers, vets, other stakeholders. What types of feedback have you received thus far and are hoping to garner from this group?
So this group is incredibly important to HISA. We have two very, very professional, really hard-working and expert standing committees with both racetrack safety and anti-doping medication control. What we were looking for was really that link between those groups who are creating the rules and horsemen who are every day living it. We wanted to bring that practical knowledge to our standing committees who also really wanted that input. So far it's been terrific. We haven't held our first group meeting yet. That's going to be next week. But I've been engaging with all the members on the group. Whenever we have an issue that comes up that I know is in somebody's, either their jurisdiction or their area of expertise, I'm now able to pick up the phone and say, here's the rule or here's the issue. What do you think? What's your experience? What would your constituents say? And being able to bring that information back to the committees and back to the HISA team, it's really invaluable.
You had said last week when visiting one state, if we get something wrong, we'll fix it, but it won't be overnight. That I felt was the key in there. So what are the biggest concerns you are trying to address that those that aren't necessarily sold on HISA need some confidence in?
Well, sure. Listen, HISA was a blank piece of paper. It really, we have not been at this very long. The rulemaking process is filled with experts, filled with dedicated people, but anytime you make a new rule, you've got to beta test it. You've got to see how it's actually operating in the field. So my point is, these rules were considered, they were debated, they're in place. Let's give it a few months, see how they're working, we'll take feedback, and whatever isn't working properly and isn't achieving our goals of safety and integrity, we're going to revise, And that's a message that I think is really important for horsemen to understand, is that it's their industry, it's our industry, we're working together. We need feedback, we need engagement, but we also need some experience with the rules.
You're about to be flooded with emails. You said feedback. What kind of feedback have you gotten thus far? What would be the overarching theme from that feedback?
So I think overall, the overarching theme is almost everyone agrees that better safety and better integrity is good for the sport. Almost everyone agrees that we need uniformity, that if we don't have uniformity, the sport cannot reach its potential. And then I think everyone has potentially a different take on some of the nuances around the rules. And what I always say, if you're talking to me about whether a rule is working or not, then you're for HISA, because you're engaging. You're talking to me how we can make the sport better. And that's really all that we want. And I think that's the vast majority of the feedback that I'm getting.
What do you feel is the biggest issue facing the sport currently?
The potential loss of public trust in the sport. And I think that's not, the industry, I think, is filled with people who are incredibly dedicated and honest. And they deserve to have their work, their life's work, match up with the public's reputation. And I think once we're in place, especially with the anti-doping program, we'll be able to tell that message. We'll be able to share, listen, we now have an independent, robust, national uniform program, and look how well everyone's doing. And we can really be that certification to the public and to the industry. Yes, the industry is working towards integrity, is really, we can trust this industry.
You're essentially touching on it there, but if we look back a year from now, what do you want to be able to say that HISA did for the sport of horse racing?
What I want to be able to say is that everybody fully accepts, is fully on board, and takes as almost a given that we want to have uniform rules, and that we want to be looked at as one sport, and that every horseman, every jockey, every owner, every participant cares about the horses and cares about integrity. And I think that is what's going to happen, and I believe that we are on the right path.
You think it's possible?
I think it's more than possible. I think it's good. I think it's going to happen.
Lisa Lazarus, CEO of Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority, better known as HISA. Thank you so much for joining us here. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.